Hello everyone, this is Mike. I have another little walkthrough. I got some requests to have kind of a basic walkthrough of making a head rig, and I'm going to start with this character. I'm going to build something very similar to that and walk through it with you, just so if you're having trouble getting going using joysticks and sliders, this will be a good starting point. I'm going to start with a new composition. I'm going to make that 600 by 600 pixels. That should work for what we're doing here. And making the head base, I'm going to create a rectangle and give it some rounding. Like that. I'm going to remove any stroke, bring its size to 0, give it a fill color. And that'll be our head base. About as simple as you can get. Next we'll make some eyes. I'm going to create an ellipse over here and bring its anchor point, the layer anchor point, over to the center. Don't necessarily have to do that, but I find it a good way to stay organized. I'm going to hit the little apostrophe or quote key. That brings up guides. It helps you center your project. I'm going to nudge his head over to make sure he's pretty well centered. Very good. I'll label this I.L. Some people prefer to have a naming convention in response to the character's left or right eye, in which case this would be I.R. When I do 2D rigging, I kind of like to think in screen left versus screen right, so I'll call this IL. Move a duplicate over here and call it I.R. Oops, I accidentally undid that. Let's start by doing a little rigging. I kind of like to get into rigging as soon as possible. I'm going to select these guys and hit P to key their position. Hitting the plus, I'm going to zoom way in so I can see things at the frame level, and hitting page up and page down will allow me to move forward and backward frame by frame. And so on the very next frame, I need to create the right pose. This is simply going to be dragging those eyes directly to the right. Don't worry that the other one goes off the head. We'll fix that up later. Seeing the transparency grade, you'll see he's over there. Page down gets me to the next frame. I can key these both by hitting paste origin and then moving them over to the left. Next, I will paste the origin and move them up. And next frame, pasting origin, moving them down. And I do feel overall they ride a little high on the head, so selecting the position properties, making sure my cursor is on one of those keyframes, I can move the whole animation up or down. But hitting the layer, I can tweak just the individual keyframe that I am on. There we go. To cut off that eye from leaving the silhouette of the head, I can make a duplicate of this head base and change its blending mode to stencil alpha. That means anything underneath this head base will not show up if it moves outside of its silhouette. I'm going to select those eyes and create a joystick. And here's my head rotation and my joystick. I'm going to bring the limit down so it doesn't take up so much space. And we've got a good start. Now let's create a few more features. With that joystick selected, I'm going to unbind it so we're back into our rigging mode. I'm going to create a nose. Now for this nose, I'm going to create it out of a rectangle a rounded rectangle. Whoops, I'm making a mask. I don't want that. Let's undo that. Make sure no layers are selected. That will create a shape layer and not create a mask on whichever layer I happen to have selected. Let's call this nose and give it a color. We'll make it red and give it enough roundness so that it looks like a circle. The reason we're using a rounded rectangle is you can change its size and create a wide, rounded sort of shape like that, which will be handy in creating an illusion of perspective in this nose. Let's start keying some things here. Origin, looking to the right. I'm going to move him over. You'll notice that now the nose peeks out of the silhouette. That's because he's placed above that head rotation stencil alpha, or the head base here. Anything above that will show up outside of the silhouette of the character. Let me move that nose down below these controllers. And in the contents of that nose, I'm going to, well, I did not key the size. I want to make sure that's being keyed. Oh, that's the head base, wrong layer. This is the layer I want to work with. Let me increase the timeline a little bit so I have a bit more room to see what's going on. Increase the width of the nose. Going back, I'll paste origin, move the nose over here, increase the width. You may wonder why, whenever possible, I like to move my objects around using the transform property group as opposed to the shape transform or the actual object transform. You can animate with either of these. I prefer to use the transform property group because they can be accessed through hotkeys. By having a layer select and hitting P, you get that position, S for scale, T for transparency, R for rotation. Hitting U will show you any properties that are keyed within that whole group. Let's paste origin and move him up. Paste origin, move him down. Let's select all these, bind to existing. I'm going to bind everything to that existing head rotator. Alright, now we have some dimensionality in that nose. Now you'll notice I didn't rig the up and down part of the nose. That's because in a diagonal you'd preferably want that nose to be at an angle. But if we rig the up and down the same way, it would have a different effect. I'll show you how that works here. Say for up, I do this to give an impression of an upper angle and lower angle. When I bind it back to that head rotator on the diagonal, instead of getting a nice diagonal angle, it's just larger. It's not quite what we want. Works good this way, works good this way, but those diagonals suffer. So for that reason, I'm going to choose my battles and just rig the left-right scaling for that nose. Let's unbind that nose and take its size back to, oops, that was the wrong, rig this property to 71, and this one to 71. There we go. Okay. Let's create the hat. The hat has another cute little thing going on in that it bends when he moves upward and downward. That sort of helps compensate for the lack of perspective in the nose as we get to do some in the hat. I'm going to create a very large rectangle above his head. Red still works for me. And tuck it under that second head base. Now there are several interesting ways that you can change the curving of this rectangle. One way is to use some of these tools here. Pucker and bloat is one of my favorites. You can change the amount of pucker and bloat on your shape, and that will give you that nice curvature. I'm going to bring the width down to this rectangle so its curve is a little more extreme, and make sure that it is centered. Let's unbind our head rotator and start creating some keys for this hat shape. I'm going to rename this head base head mat. So I'm really just going to animate the pucker and bloat on the hat, have it start at 0. The right will look the same as will the left, but the up is going to look like this, and the down is going to look like that. Let's rebind that joystick and play around with it. Pretty good. Unbinding, I'm going to create the brim of this hat. This is going to be a duplicate of this hat. Bring it above the head mat and turn off the fill. I turn it off clicking that eyeball, and while I'm at it, I'll often bring the opacity down to 0 so it doesn't show up again. I'm going to bring the stroke up, and this is our brim. Now what I'm going to do to chop it off, you see the problem is you're seeing a lot more of the outline of this shape than you want to. I'm going to fix that by creating a mat. This will be another rectangle layer that lives on top of everything. Tuck that right above that hat shape 2, which should be called brim. Let's call this brim mat. On brim, I can change its track mat to alpha mat, and now that brim mat contains the shape of that brim. That's good. I think I should just animate the position of that mat so that it stays within the shape of that line. That's fine. Select all, rebind everything. Play with our joystick. All right, we have some good animation. Let's create that beard. The beard is essentially one object that tracks along this whole head, and it's one shape with that contains the left, middle, and right side of the face. I'll show you how that works. Let's deselect everything. Go. Start way off to the side. And have it go way beyond the bounds of our character's face. And I'll give him a little extra soul patch. Bring that shape layer down below that head base. Head mat. And there we go. Let's move its key poses. Bring its position to the right. Position to the left. Paste origin to center it back up. Move it up. Paste origin, move back, down. And let's give it a more hair color, more of a dark brown. And while I'm here, I might just make my mouth. Make a mouth, drag it down just above the beard, remove the fill. Make the stroke a, say, black, and I'm going to change the ending to round cap so it's nice and softened. Maybe make it just a little thicker. And instead of keying this, I can save myself a little bit of time by just parenting it, by pick whipping to that beard. And with the transparency grid, you'll see it gets cut off by the silhouette just fine. Let's select everything, rebind to that head rotator. And alright, we have a working hipster head right here. So I may go forth and show you some of the rigging of the body, but this is a good starting point for your head rigging. You can also look at some of my other tutorials to show you how you can rig animated path shapes. And really, there are no rules in 2D rigging. It's a relatively new form compared to 3D rigging. And each rig really is dictated by its design and by the uses that are needed from it. 2D rigs are a lot faster to build than 3D rigs, but they do have their limitations. There does come a point where if you want to build a 2D rig that is so convincing that it looks 3D, you might save your time by just working in a 3D environment. Anyhow, I hope this gets working with joysticks and sliders. It's a great way to create these graphic sort of characters. All right, thank you. Bye.